All right, so here we go with some really cool research that came out of the trade approach. And we're going to start out with personality at work, the big five in the work environment. And what we find is that, not surprising, number one, for all employers, what they are the most interested in, usually finding out about people before they hire them, um, on the different personality traits is conscientiousness. So out of the big five, the one that they're the most interested in knowing is conscientiousness. Now, they go about different ways of trying to find this out. Most of them do through your references. Okay, but number one, even if it's a job like McDonald's, okay, they do care whether you're going to show up for work and show up on time, whether they can depend on you, right? But then when it comes to the second one of the big five that they're the most interested in, then it really depends on the job. Let me give you 3 examples here. If it is a job that really requires teamwork, okay, then they are going to be their second concern will be agreeableness. Um, and that tends to be the case because of things like cooperation, right, that's involved in the idea or that cluster of agreeableness. And if it's a job where sales, okay, is the focus, they're most interested in extroversion. And remember that until recently, they've really been looking for people who score the highest on extroversion. But recent research has suggested that people that are more towards the middle of the scale, that score more in that mid-range, are actually better salespeople. They do a better job, are more successful at sales. Okay, and that is called ambiverts, people in the middle, ambiverts. Um, it's probably going to take a while for that research, very recent research that just came out, to have an effect in the work world with employers, but we are probably going to be looking at that down the road. And then if the job requires, if the major component of the job requires creativity, then we tend to see their second priority here after conscientiousness to be openness. There's also some really interesting research on personality and marriage. Okay, and here is where we're looking again at that trait term as more of an umbrella term. So remember that it includes styles, okay? And what the trait approach researchers found with marriage was not that the big five could predict things the best, but instead the style that you have of actually reacting to arguments. Okay, so people react with a lot of different styles. And if you look at the underlying emotions, there are 4 in particular, 4 reaction styles that were divorce predictors. Okay, 4 in particular. So if somebody reacts to an argument, their major way that they tend to react is by criticizing the other person or treating the other person with contempt or getting very defensive. Okay, those are big predictors of divorce. And the 4th one is stonewalling. Sometimes people aren't as familiar with this one, but the idea of stonewalling is cutting the other person off in some way. Okay? And one of the most common ways that we see that being played out would be maybe the silent treatment, okay? Or simply being unresponsive to the other person in some way. Now, sometimes, people will look at these predictors, these styles, and recognize themselves and say, oh, this means I must be doomed, right, for divorce. Now remember that knowledge is power, right? So what you can do, you recognize that you have one or more of these styles of reacting to arguments, and there's a relationship that you really value and you really want to work in your life, then you can try to do something about that. In other words, you can change how you react in an environment. Yes, it's not the default for you, so it's going to take effort and it's going to take motivation. You're really going to you're really going to have to care about this relationship and then put some effort into changing your reaction from the default here. Because if you don't think about it, that is, you're going to react with your default. Or if you don't care. So if that relationship isn't that meaningful to you, you're going to react with the default. Now, we talked about the fact that researchers have looked at other species of animals in the Big Five. So the big question was, do we see the same variation that we find in humans on the Big Five? When we look at other species, do we find that same bell curve? Do they really vary across the Big Five? Hey, there are a lot of researchers that have looked into this, but Gosling is number one. So I want you to know Gosling, and especially this 2001 study. I want you to be familiar with Gosling 2001, because that is a study where he has shown it across the largest variation in species. Okay. And in fact, this particular study is where he finds this normal distribution, bell curve, across these particular species, dogs. Okay, that may not be that surprising, right? Dogs are, what do they say, humans' best friend. Primates, again, not as surprising as some of the other species because human beings belong to this category. Okay, rhinos, hedgehogs, and, believe it or not, ants. So remember that Gosling found it across dogs, primates, rhinos, hedgehogs, and ants, even ants. You might wonder, how in the world did they find this? It's not like they can give them our paper and pencil measures, right? And the methods that they use is that they have blind independent coders observe these animals, and they rate their behavior in a number of different things, on a number of different scales. So let me just give you one example. For instance, for openness to experience, of course, they're going to look at their behavior and rate a number of different things, but one of them is, to what extent does this animal seem curious? Do they tend to seek out novelty? And to what extent do they avoid novelty and stick to routine, prefer to just stick to routine? So that's how they do it when looking across these different species. Now, many of you have heard about type A personality before. Many of you may not have. So when we talk about type A personality, okay, we're talking about somebody who's really highly competitive, tends to be very efficient, so they can get a lot of work done in a shorter period of time than other people. They tend to also, besides competitiveness and being very efficient, they tend to be driven with time urgency, so they're always trying to beat the clock. Okay, so they're trying to get things done faster than average. They tend to be very task-oriented, okay? And so until they complete a task, they tend to be very focused on it. And Another component of this is that they can become very easily angered or easily become hostile. And when we say easily, we don't mean by a lot of provocation. We mean just in little things in life, like losing your car keys, for instance. Okay. Now, we talk about a type B personality. This is the opposite. So this is going to be someone who is more relaxed than normal. Somebody for which there doesn't seem to be time urgency. Um, Somebody who is significantly less competitive and is not easily angered or easily becoming hostile with those little things in life, like losing your car keys or having to wait in a long line. Those things that happen every day, right? Now, type A and type B, one of the reasons why type A personality has really become so well known is that because of its predictive validity. So it correlates with so many different things. For instance, and helps us predict so many different things. For instance, people with a type A personality tend to set the highest goals for themselves. So they tend to set higher than normal goals. For instance, if they're a student, they tend to take more credit hours than the average. People with type A personalities tend to receive more honors and awards. Okay, they also tend to have higher salaries, and they tend to advance in their jobs, so work their way up the ladder faster than average, and they tend to work longer hours. Now, sometimes people look at this list and they think that's all a pretty good thing. Except maybe the working longer hours. You know, some people might view that as good. Some people might view that as bad. That's more ambiguous, right? But this last one, this last correlate, this last predictive validity item is definitely a negative. And that is they tend to have less job satisfaction. Isn't that interesting? You know, their salaries tend to be higher, they advance faster in their jobs, but they still tend to have less satisfaction from their job. Okay. Then, all of this is true, and all of this is important. These are important correlates. Okay. But one came out that really, really made the news. Okay, and kind of put this negative damper on the idea of type A personality. What was that? Some of you might have known that the answer to that is that type A personality is associated with higher blood pressure and all the cardiovascular risk that goes with that. Okay, so this was really interesting research and really grabbed people's attention because up until then, people were really thinking type A is the way to be. You know, people get better jobs, they tend to get better salaries, they advance higher in their jobs. All this achievement goes with it. Hey, but then when they came up with this idea, with this research that type A personalities tend to have significantly higher blood pressure and higher risk of all the cardiovascular problems that go with that, you know, then people really started to be worried about type A personality. But that really brought about a question because the first impulse was for people to say, you don't want to be type A. But then, you know, when people started calming down and thinking about it more logically, you know, they started to think, wait a minute, type A is a whole cluster of traits. You know, we just talked about a bunch of them. You know, competitiveness, efficiency, time urgency, task-oriented. All of these are, you know, associated, easily angered and hostile. You know, these are all components of type A personality. They're all pieces of the pie. And it is possible, you know, to not have a slice of the pie and to still have type A personality be high on the rest, right? Hey, if you think about it in those terms, then the big question became, what are the toxic components or component of type A? So what is it in particular about type A personality that is correlated with the high blood pressure and higher risk of cardiovascular problems? And researchers nailed it. And that component was the easily angered / hostile component. Okay, so that idea that you become easily angered or hostile at these little things that happen all the time. We gave examples of being in a long line. We gave an example of losing your car keys. You know, these are the type of things that can kind of set off a little Tourette's bout on your part. Or being at a particularly long stoplight would be another example, right? But things that happen constantly all the time, every day. Okay, if you're a type A personality, but you do not have that one component, good for you. You don't have to worry about it, right? That is great. But, and, you know, there are a lot of benefits of being type A if you don't have that particular component. Now, if you're type A personality, we tend to know it, right? And if you're a type A and you do have that component, okay, hostile, angry kind of component, again, knowledge is power. Bringing that to consciousness means that you can come up with plans, triggers and plans to combat that. So you might think, well, the next time I'm at a light, I'm going to have a long stoplight. I'm going to have my fingernail clippers available and make use of that time. Remember, type A personalities tend to be multitaskers. So that might be a great kind of a plan, but come up with those triggers. If I'm standing in a long line, what am I going to do? If I'm at a stoplight, what can I do to use that time better instead of getting hostile and feeling frustrated, right? Speaking of type A personality, now we want you to get out questionnaire 3. Not questionnaire 3, I'm sorry, your self-assessment sheet. And take a look at your score for questionnaire 3. We're going to interpret that now. Okay. So first off, in the name, for the name, you can put type A personality. Type A personality. And then over in the, remember you want to interpret this in light of the ASU student mean. This is a mean for students who've taken this class before. So it's hundreds of students, but students who've taken this class before. And the mean for ASU students you can now add in there too, which is 76. 76. Here's some other information. The range of possible scores here was 0 to 130. So 130 is the highest score you can get. 0 is the lowest. The mean for ASU students being 76. Okay. If your score is 103 or higher, you are probably a type A personality. Okay. If your score is actually 50 or lower, you're probably a type B. If you're somewhere in between there, you're probably neither.